Hi, today I'm going to read this section, The Unexpected Audio, from my book, Expecting the Good. Jean-Luc's roommate at West Point was Don Mooney, and he shared an audio interview of Jean-Luc. It was so cool to hear Jean-Luc's voice sharing some funny stories of his time at West Point. It actually made me tear up. The interview occurred in the late summer of 2015, about 9 months before his death in 2016. Don is a people person and very honest by Jean-Luc's description. They both have this unique ability to connect with others and are very determined. They can be laser focused and make it happen, whatever they're trying to attain. This is probably an attribute of their West Point training. Jean-Luc started off explaining that West Point is set up in a regimental format with 4 different regiments. He mentioned that the 1st regiment had a very stern reputation, that they were, quote, hard asses. The 4th regiment had a reputation of being more fun and looser. Can you guess which regiment Don and Jean-Luc were part of? Jean-Luc and Don were in the same company and were assigned to D4. In Jean-Luc's interview, he emphasized the importance of the mess hall, and some people call it the chow hall. There are unique traditions to dining there that are developed by the cadet companies. He didn't get into specific traditions for his company. Jean-Luc and Don each had a bit of rebel streak in them, apparently. Jean-Luc mentioned in the West Point Honor Code is don't lie, steal, or tolerate those that do. Jean-Luc then continued to state, that doesn't mean you can't break the rules. If you happen to get caught, just don't lie about it. Well, Don had a tendency to get caught when he broke a rule. His biggest infraction had him confined to the campus for almost the last 2 years at West Point. As a junior, you're not allowed to have a car. Apparently, Don did have a car, but kept it off campus in a garage near Newburgh, New Jersey. Don was caught when his girlfriend, Narcissa, had an accident outside the gate of Camp Buckner after visiting Don the summer before his junior year. She was going to drive the car back to Newburgh for him, but did not have a driver's license at the time. The car was registered in Don's name. So Jean-Luc filled in and took Don's girlfriend out on dates, but she was able to visit Don on campus. Jean-Luc took her to the clubs on a regular basis. He spent more time with Narcissa than Don did the last 2 years at West Point. You are allowed to get a car your senior year. Don just did it too soon, and you can never get a motorcycle. It was frowned upon. Well, it turns out that Jean-Luc got a motorcycle his senior year. You'd think he would have been afraid to break a rule after being Don's roommate. That didn't stop him from getting a 500cc VSA Victor Special. Jean-Luc described the motorcycle as a classic British motorcycle, which is code for not reliable. It broke down a lot, in other words. The electronics didn't work and always had problems. He kept it off base, but didn't mention where it was stored. So most times he had to hitchhike bike back to West Point. Yet it was worth it to him because he got to ride out around the state of New York on a motorcycle. Hitchhiking became one of Jean-Luc's favorite things to do since he didn't have reliable transportation. When Don was able to leave the campus, they would hitchhike together. The first big hitchhiking expedition was to Houston, Texas, where Don is from, and they went there via Alabama. The second big hitchhiking adventure was to New York City. They got a partial ride back from 2 girls and were dropped off by a wall near a bridge, but that it was actually part of a cemetery. It was very dark in wintertime and very cold. They found a moving truck that had some blankets inside. It wasn't locked, obviously. So Don and Jean-Luc decided to borrow the blankets and slept by that wall and didn't realize they were near a cemetery until the morning. When they woke up at dawn, they returned the blankets to the truck and hitchhiked back to West Point. Another thing that they liked to do was to go to clubs, specifically a club in Newburgh, that it was an all-black club. That ended when Don was in confinement. As mentioned before, Jean-Luc would take Don's girlfriend out instead by himself, and that included that Newburgh club. One night they were dancing, and some random guy came up to Jean-Luc and Narcissa and stated, "You can do better than that, honky." There was a pause, and Jean-Luc replied, "Yes, she can," instead of punching him, which is probably what would have happened if John, Luke, and Don were together. Thankfully, nothing happened, and they kept on dancing, enjoying themselves. Richard Nixon came to visit the campus at one point. It's a tradition that when a president visits West Point, he will grant amnesty to all the cadets, particularly important to those in confinement. That is how Don got amnesty. To his day, Don actually likes Richard Nixon because the amnesty erased the confinement from his records. Don learned his lesson about breaking the rules after that. Jean-Luc and Don graduated in 1975, which is also America's 200th birthday, an extra celebration for that class. When you graduate from West Point, you get a 60-day break before your military assignment. Don was engaged and planned to get married in that time frame. But first, Don had to have a bachelor party. The quote, bachelor party basically consisted of Don and Jean-Luc, and they decided to take a flight to Spain and hitchhike to Denmark to fly back to the US. They didn't really think it through much. There was no planning involved. Don told Jean-Luc that he could speak Spanish and would take care of getting around Spain and order food. And Jean-Luc could speak French, and he would take care of that part. But Don didn't really know Spanish as much as he thought. Every meal in Spain was squid. No matter where they were, squid was included. Side note, one of Jean-Luc's favorite meals to order at a Thai restaurant with the family was a squid salad. Hitchhiking was harder to do in Europe because they stood out. They were big Americans and couldn't fit in a lot of the European vehicles. They got a little desperate at one point and hopped onto a flatbed truck that was parked at a restaurant and hid under some covers. The border guard in France did not notice them, thankfully. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. Since they ended up in France, they stayed longer than expected there and visited with some of Jean-Luc's relatives. They got out of France in a similar manner, hiding in the bed of a truck. When they arrived in Switzerland, one of the first things they did was stop to eat at a Swiss restaurant that was advertised as, quote, all you could eat. As Americans, they ate way too much and were asked to leave the restaurant. Later on, they hitchhiked to Amsterdam and ended up at a club. Some random guy came up to them and asked to look at Jean-Luc's West Point ring. This guy also asked Jean-Luc to take the ring off so that he could hold it. Don responded, "Don't you do that." Jean-Luc ignored Don and took his ring off and handed it to this random guy. Once the ring was in his hand, that guy tried to run off with it. A fight ensued, but Jean-Luc got his ring back. I've learned that Jean-Luc, by the way, is very trusting of others and gives them a benefit of the doubt up front. This, quote, bachelor party ended up being 32 days in Europe. Since Jean-Luc was the best man, he had to make sure the groom arrived for the wedding, and they got back just in time. Don mentioned at the Benny's wake for Jean-Luc, which was after his funeral, that as best man, Jean-Luc was responsible for the wedding rings. Guess what? Jean-Luc forgot them, and they had to drive to Narcissa's parents' house. All the doors were locked, so they climbed up the wall in their dress blues into an open window on the second floor to gain access to the house. And the rings were found, thankfully. They ended up back at the church with the rings, and a little sweaty and dusty. Jean-Luc didn't mention forgetting the wedding rings in the interview that I listened to. The military life takes you all over and separates you from close friends and family. These are Jean-Luc's exact words from the interview. Over the years, he and Don have kept in touch. Jean-Luc then went to the jump school basic course immediately after in Fort Benning, Georgia. Then he was stationed in Korea, Turkey, and Germany, where Jean-Luc was a special forces officer. Don was stationed in Germany too in the same time frame, and they were able to visit a few times over there. Then they didn't see each other again until after they both retired from the military. Don moved back to Houston, and Jean-Luc was in Florida. Jean-Luc considered Don to be his best friend. Actually has two best friends, Don and his wife, Narcissa. Jean-Luc didn't meet and marry my mother until 7 years after he graduated from West Point. He thought it was important that spouses connect, and he was very happy that my mom and Narcissa did connect. Everyone has a different take on their shared experiences. There's a lot of information available about West Point and different topics. Zachary Wiley recommended I locate the yearbook from their 1975 graduation. There's a quote for each graduate that encapsulates the experience there. Don actually wrote Jean-Luc's yearbook quote, and it's a perfect description of him. Here it is. His faded blue jeans, grease-stained shirt only supplement the spirit of the, quote, easy rider who lived for adventure. Whether thumbing, climbing, cycling, or dreaming about it in class, Jean-Luc never let his mind stay here longer than necessary.